In 2013, horror games were going through an identity crisis. Resident Evil and Dead Space have both lost their horror edge and made themselves into action-heavy shooters that divided fanbases. In the indie space, however, the genre was having a bit more of a resurgence. Amnesia: The Dark Descent, Slender, SCP, Cry of Fear, among many others, provided a whole new form of horror gaming, thanks to the building success of YouTube gaming. These games were often cheap and made by only a handful of developers with very limited resources, yet they created new experiences that still linger in people's minds to this day. On September 4th, 2013, Red Barrels, a team consisting of ex-EA and Ubisoft Montreal developers, released Outlast, a horror game set in a psychiatric hospital that's now been overrun by homicidal patients. There's no way to fight back and you must rely on the game's stealth system to survive. It was a massive success, and in 2014, the game was brought to more systems such as PlayStation 4 and Xbox One, as well as Red Barrels offering more gameplay in the form of a DLC titled The Whistleblower. After 3 years of silence, Red Barrels released on April 25th, 2017, Outlast 2, the long-awaited follow-up, and I want to talk about it. In order to understand Outlast 2 properly, it's worth going through the plot. So of course, if you haven't played Outlast 2, then spoilers ahead. In Outlast 2, you play as Blake Langerman, a cameraman on the hunt to find out what happens to a pregnant woman known only as a Jane Doe. Alongside your wife Lynn, you both end up in a helicopter crash that results in the disappearance of Lynn. As you search for her, you discover a vicious cult led by a man named Father Sullivan. Father Sullivan attempts to sacrifice Lynn as you discover that she is now pregnant with the Antichrist. You both escape before Lynn is taken away yet again, but this time not by Father Sullivan, but some person named Val. Whether it's a boy or a girl, I don't know. They're being really ambiguous with it, so we'll just move past that. Val's a weirdo. I'll get to Val in a bit. Blake is now on the hunt for Lynn yet again, but then ends up in the care of a fairly normal dude who turns out is actually the father of the Jane Doe you're looking for. He is then killed by Marta, this kind of, dollar store, pyramid head kind of character with a big ass pickaxe, and you manage to escape again and discover that Lynn is actually being held in the mines. On your journey to the mines, you get attacked by these syphilis people called the Scaled, and you get captured by Warwick Davis, who believe Blake is a prophet. They crucify him, but then Blake manages to escape from this crucifixion and go on his merry way, avoiding this enemy as he goes on his travels. But let's back up a little bit. At the start of the game, Blake dreams of a young girl in an empty school that is suddenly swept by blood. Throughout the game, as you search for Lynn, Blake has various visions set in this school that gradually reveal the story of his past and the massive, absolutely massive amount of emotional baggage he has. Seriously, it's fucking loads. Anyway, you eventually find out that in his childhood, Blake had a best friend named Jessica. Jessica was a troubled girl with issues happening both at school and at home. During one night when you're at the school after dark, you are caught by Father Loutermilk, your music teacher. Loutermilk takes Jessica away and proceeds to beat and molest her. When you find Jessica, she's already dead, and you are manipulated by Loutermilk to make her death look like a hanging. It's dark, disturbing, and not all handled well, but I'll talk a little more about these scenes shortly. Anyway, Blake enters the mines and finds Lynn, who is now super pregnant. That baby is about ready to explode out of there. Blake is then raped by Val. Yep, Father Sullivan then attacks Val and their followers, leaving Blake and Lynn with the chance to escape. Martha tries to kill Lynn and Blake before she's impaled by a cross, in symbolism that I think only Zack Snyder himself could achieve. Blake and Lynn end up in a chapel. Lynn gives birth. Well, maybe she did. Ooh. Lynn dies, Blake passes out, and then wakes up to Father Sullivan, who has a little monologue about killing all of his followers before telling Blake to kill the child before finally killing himself in his second scene. You don't really get a lot of time with them, but we'll get to that shortly. Anyway, Blake manages to leave. He is engulfed by a massive ray of light. We see one last vision of Blake and Jessica, who pray together, and that's it. So, what happened? Outlast 2 likes to do this thing where the story's mostly up to your own interpretation, while also at the same time offering next to nothing to go off on other than vague moments and visuals. Throughout the game, there's sudden bursts of light that seemingly mess up the people around Blake, and this is left unexplained. That is, unless you're looking for it. Near the end of the game, a note can be found that basically explains that all the crazy shit that's been going on with the cult revolves around some nearby radio towers that are run by no other than the Murkoff Corporation, the essential face of the Outlast series. Think Umbrella, but rather than zombies and whatever Resident Evil 6 was, they're more into experimenting on people and making them crazy for, I don't know, funsies, I guess. The problem here is just how buried this one note is, considering that it adds a whole new layer of context to the game. In a game like Remedy's Control, released in 2019, notes and readings are used to provide more context to the game, but if you didn't read the note or decided you didn't want to, there's still a simple plot that you can follow, and if you have questions, the game offers answers for you to find, while also making the hunt for them engaging. In Outlast 2, the notes and collectibles you find are just not that interesting to read. They're mostly just uninteresting stories and anecdotes that try the hardest to be scary and frightening, but mostly fall apart and are just fairly boring reads. In Outlast 1, notes were used both to offer information about the location and the shadowy Murkoff Corporation, while also offering you what the character of Outlast 1 was feeling at the time. Which now brings me to the characters of Outlast 2. Outlast 1 had you playing as a sad protagonist whose thoughts and emotions were mostly left through edgy notes that are written throughout the game. Outlast 2 ditches this and instead goes for a voiced character in the form of Blake Langerman. The moment I heard this dude's voice, particularly during the gameplay sections, a major red flag was put up for me. The voice acting isn't all that great, but even worse than that, it's just how uninteresting Blake is as a character. Even with his backstory told in the school sections, he mostly falls flat. As you play through the game, Blake can use his camera to take videos of events happening around him and then can make an observation or two, much like Miles with the notes in the first game. However, while the note would be automatically given to you in Outlast 1, in Outlast 2 you have to stand around, record a certain thing, and then Blake would talk about it. And add absolutely fucking nothing. This just absolutely grinds the game to a halt every single time you do it, and what he says most of the time is never all that interesting and often just repeats what he said seconds prior. Even when Blake's world shatters around him and the game does everything in its power to tell you how crazy he's becoming thanks to the beam of lights and obviously the search for Lair and all of these different things, it just doesn't show in the character and his voice acting, as it mostly just stays as just a static, generic, scared man. Lynn is mostly just a disposable damsel in distress and isn't given much to go off, much like Jessica, the childhood friend who you don't really see too much of. Granted, Jessica does get some occasional bits here and there, but nothing with the character herself. It's not necessarily a bad thing, but I think I would have preferred if Lynn had a little bit more to go off on. Where the Outlast games really shine is in the antagonists, usually. Outlast 2 has many of these. Val, Father Sullivan, Marta, Laird Byron, or Warwick Davis rather. But sadly, none of these are really all that unique beyond their admittedly neat designs. Val is a sexual predator who pops up a few times throughout the game and is finally killed by Father Sullivan, ending a civil war between Father Sullivan's followers and Val's followers, the heretics. Most of this is through the notes that you find throughout the game. It's really not that interesting. For me personally. Martha is a big ass pickaxe and chases you throughout the game before she's of course impaled by a cross at the end. Admittedly cool design aside, she lacks any real fear factor and you just encounter her so many times. She's not a bad idea of an antagonist, but not one I particularly remember fondly because of just, to me, she literally appears every fucking 5 minutes. I mean, the amount of times I'll be going through a section and it's just, she shows up again. It's like, I don't care. I don't care, love. Fuck off. Laird Byron, or Warwick Davis, is honestly my favourite out of the bunch. A deformed dwarf that is mounted on the top of a dude who leads a group of diseased people named the Scaled. This whole sequence involving having to escape from him and seeing how the Scaled live was easily one of the most consistent sections of the game, and the absolutely disgusting designs were fucking great. While his death is admittedly a giant cop-out, it was still a pretty fun and creepy section of the game. Father Sullivan, to me, though, was easily the weakest antagonist of the game. He's in like 2 cutscenes and you never really have a chance to get to know him unless you read all the notes. It's honestly so strange that he's even on a box art of the Outlast trilogy. The Outlast trilogy, Trinity, Blade Trinity collection, when compared to Tragnan and Eddie Gluskin from the first game, who are also present, who are far more iconic characters. I mean, both of them are trying to cut your fucking dick off. Actually, one's cutting your hand off, the other one's cutting your dick off, but you might as well be cutting your dick off. Outlast 2, when it comes to characters, often feels like it's trying too hard to recreate the fucked up nature of the first game, but it's far more of a mixed bag here. No one is on the level of the Outlast 1 characters, which isn't a problem, but when Red Battles tries its absolute hardest to make them just as iconic, it just falls flat. But let's take a break from talking about the narrative side of the game, and let's talk about everything else that it has to offer. As much as I've been dragging this game, there's genuinely a lot of stuff in here that I like. The game is absolutely beautiful, and for me, ran like a dream on my base PlayStation 4. When you control Blake for the first time in the school hallway, I was blown away by how absolutely beautiful it looked. Outlast 1, to this day, still looks fairly impressive, and Outlast 2 builds on that presentation and improves it in every way. It's a beautiful game to look at, and it's one of the reasons why it kept me going. The sound design also deserves some props. One of the new mechanics in the game is the use of a microphone that can better detect sound that comes particularly handy during the stealth sections thanks to Blake's far more advanced camcorder. Hearing the footsteps and crazed dialogue of the enemies is super effective at making the area around you truly feel dangerous. The core gameplay of Outlast 2 stays relatively the same as the first game, even with the inclusion of an inventory system. Go through a spooky location, don't die, and that's pretty much it. That said though, the stealth in this weirdly felt like an afterthought, and you could practically run through most of this game. Outlast 1 practically forces you to think smart and be as stealthy as possible, but here, it feels like you can kind of just waltz past most of the enemies, which is a shame. When you're not doing this stuff though, you're actually in the best part of the game. The school. Honestly, Outlast 2 is one of the scariest games I've ever played. Sometimes. Throughout the game, you'll find yourself in an empty school that serves as a backstory to Blake's past. These scenes simply put on an absolute masterpiece in horror. Going through the empty hallways while playing the game at like 1 AM in the morning is a memory I'll forever cherish, and honestly, it's the main reason why I kept playing the game anyway. I was dragging myself through the fairly mundane shit, but we're trying to rescue Lynn and all of that, just to see what the next school scene was going to entail. Now, they're certainly not perfect. A lot of the time you spend in these sequences is no doubt going to be looking for what you've got to do next, and once the game introduces the big scary monster, it does run out of steam a little bit, as a lot of these scenes just entail you running away from said monster. Cool design, but not all too interesting. But man, these moments are just easily the crown jewel of the entire game. In some ways, they feel almost like they were made by an entirely different team. There's just so many great little details shown in these sequences too. The hands that occasionally pop up around the camera, and the brief flashes of enemies running past you would always get me feeling even more intense than I already was, to the point where I was even covering my eyes during certain segments. The dread and anticipation of waiting for something to scare me was just so powerful and what I wanted to see more of throughout the game. The transitions as well that lead you to these segments are like insanely impressive. The computer room and library sequences are just so absolutely chilling, especially the computer room sequence with how it shows Jessica's turmoil with the abuse she was receiving at home. It's just so well done, even if it's just one quick scene. It's not necessarily going to make you shake your pants, but it's just this really chilling moment that I don't think that many people really talk about. I mean, I could honestly gush about how amazing these sequences are for hours on end, but I have an ending to talk about. Outlast 2's main sin for me is just how much of an absolute flatline its narrative is. Outlast 1 tells a fairly simple story. You're a journalist exploring a hospital that is secretly a front for a mysterious organisation that's experimenting on patients. It's certainly not going to win any writing awards, but it gets the job done for the horror to take centre stage. Outlast 2 tries to go for something more than that, which isn't a bad thing inherently. The foundation is there for the game to tell a really interesting story, but it instead focuses on trying to make things as mysterious and ambiguous as possible but it really doesn't need to be. When you're hiding key plot points away in random notes, that's just poor game design, and it's so frustrating knowing the potential that the game has. If I had to describe Outlast 2 in one word, it would absolutely be frustrating. It's simultaneously the best and worst Outlast game, with some fantastic pieces of horror that are just let down by bland storytelling and a lack of any real cohesion. It attempts to be this ambitious behemoth of a game that, while admirable, ultimately hates the game. The ending is a complete cop-out and just left me feeling bitter about the whole experience. Now, over time, I've come to appreciate the game and the stuff it does right just a little bit more, but there's just too many issues in this one for me to truly overlook. It's got the foundation, as I said, for an absolutely fantastic horror game, and when it wants to be that game, it absolutely does it in spades. It just would have been nice if the whole experience was just like that. Now, Red Barrels are apparently releasing a brand new Outlast game this year in the form of the Outlast Trials, a cooperative experience set during the Cold War. It's an interesting departure from the norm, and I'm 100% going to give it a chance. Red Barrels are an insanely talented studio when all is said and done. Outlast 2 may have been a swing and a miss, but there's always the next one.